Joining the podcast today is Dr. Clay Routledge, a leading expert in existential psychology. His work has been featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Guardian, the Atlantic, the New Yorker, Wired, Forbes, and more. He is the co-editor of Profectus, a magazine on human progress and flourishing, and the vice president of research and director of the Human Flourishing Lab at the Archbridge Institute, which has a new project called the Progress Pulse Initiative, which we'll be discussing today, and also recently came out with something called Visions of the Future that we'll be getting into. But first, Clay, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me. How are you doing, Chelsea?
All right, thanks for asking. So let's start with Progress Pulse. This sets out to explore a fundamental question about the future. Do Americans believe humans will make significant progress on big societal and global challenges in the coming decades, making life better for future generations? Or do they think we will fail to make progress, making life worse for future generations? Tell me about this project and what you found.
So I'll lead with the top finding, which is, we talk about division, polarization in this country, right? And we often think about it along political lines, but what we find is that a big division is Americans seem to be pretty evenly split between those who look to the future and see hope and promise and progress and advancement for future generations. That's, about half see that, and the other half look and see decline and have a more pessimistic outlook, think that life will be worse for future generations. So Americans are roughly evenly split along those lines. We can get to other things, other data points on that. But stepping back a little bit, the driver of this progress project is a broader project that, I just kind of refer to as the psychology of progress. As as someone in this kind of human progress space, there's a lot of interest around sort of what are the economic policies, what are the technological and scientific drivers of progress, maybe even what are the institutional forces and things like that. All of that very important, critical, of course. But one thing that I noticed when I started following, the different thinkers in this space is there wasn't a lot of talk about what's going on inside individual humans, like their minds, like their brains. So what is the sort of psychological component of progress, which obviously connects to those other things because institutions shape a lot of how we think shapes those institutions, and so forth. So since I'm a psychologist, I was like, oh, that's something I can contribute because I'm really, I love this space. I think it's great that there's so much growing interest around human progress. So I was like, oh, maybe that's where I can have a role to play is bringing in the individual psychological components of progress. So that's the basic idea of the psychology of progress and a lot of projects we're doing around that. It's just a recognition that, of course, when you think about individual traits, we think about curiosity, openness, creativity, but also the things that make people persist, like resilience, motivation, and then like teams, like how do you lead teams? How do you like cultivate talent, help people reach their potential? How do you manage conflict? At the cultural level, even if you think of progress as being driven by perhaps a small group of people who are the innovators, who are the people that are really thinking creatively, first of all, they have to be discovered and supported. And second of all, a lot of times there's teams behind them. There's a bunch of people behind them. And critically, like cultures matter. Like societies matter. People elect leaders to enact visions of how to govern our society, what to prioritize, what direction to take. And that, of course, matters. The leaders pursue certain policies or agendas based in part on what the public thinks. The media plays a significant role in kind of creating or promoting a certain vibe and attitude in the public of like what's possible, which can inspire us or depress us. So I think all these things, psychology matters. That's a long way of getting to the progress pulse idea. So, we came up with this notion of, in addition to studying these kind of more individual traits, it's good to get a sense of what does the public think about progress. And so we recently launched this project that'll be roughly every month. We'll be doing a national survey of around 2,000 US adults, a nationally representative survey in partnership with the Harris Poll. And we'll just be asking every month Americans a couple questions. And we started the very first one, which is the one we're talking about today. We started with a very simple question of like, when you look to the future, does it look, do you see progress or do you see decline? And that gets back to like people are pretty evenly divided on that, and the adult American public.
So sentiment on that is fairly split, but you did find some differences among groups. You found that
Mhm.
the youngest Americans are actually the most pessimistic about the future, especially young women,
Hmm.
while older Americans are the most optimistic. What do you think might be some of the factors behind that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So in a previous survey where we were looking at the related concept of hope, we found that self-reported mental health was the strongest predictor of people's attitudes about the future, and young people report worse mental health. So that seemed to account for a lot of the reasons they were more pessimistic, which makes sense, right? If you're depressed, if you're anxious, part of those pathologies or part of those like internal experiences are looking around and seeing the bad things, fixating on what's going wrong instead of what's going right. And so it seems to be characteristic of those conditions. But it also just goes with this broader like attitude that young people seem to have, not just depression and anxiety about their own situation, but just this kind of sort of a passive outward looking towards the world and feeling helpless or a lack of like agency that they can make a difference in the world. And so I think there's a lot of that going on. It's weird because like it's not that long ago that you might ask somebody like young people versus old people, who sees the future as bright? And they would guess young people because, I mean, obviously they have a longer life on this planet ahead of them, most of them. And also, we tend to stereotype young people as being like naive optimists or having like youthful energy and all of that. And not that that doesn't exist, of course, you can still find that, but on average, what we're finding is inconsistent with that view of young people, which is they're actually more pessimistic. Now, on the other side, you might say, well, older people have the advantage of wisdom, experience. They can look back and say, yeah, we thought this was, you think now's bad. We had world wars. We had the threat of nuclear Armageddon and the arms race with the Soviet Union. We made it through that temporary setbacks, progress kept going, and so they have that perspective that maybe young people don't have. So it could be it's not just the vulnerabilities that younger generations have, but it could also be the strengths that older generations have that make them a little bit more able to see like to have more perspective about a bright future.
So maybe there's a lesson there about the importance of historical perspective. And it was especially young women who seem to
That's right.
have a darker view of the future. Now, I know many people associate young women in the United States with the Democratic Party since they're more
Hmm.
likely to identify with that political party, but your polling actually revealed that Democrats were more optimistic on average than Republicans with independents split down the middle. And these findings were released prior to the November election. So
Correct.
one wonders, well, if this polling was conducted, during a Democratic presidential administration, is this just a result of people tending to feel more pessimistic when their political team is out of power and more optimistic when their political team is in power? Or what do you think explains this trend that seems to go against the other trends that you identified?
Yeah, no, those are great points. I definitely think there's something to what you're saying because there is certainly other types of polling that sort of show that, like, when your team's in power, yeah, you tend to have a more positive attitude. What's interesting about how that intersects with gender, as you pointed out, is if you look just at women, like you said, who tend to lean more Democratic, if you look just at women, they represent the biggest difference. It's young women who are the most pessimistic and women over 65 who are the most optimistic, even more optimistic or more hopeful than men. Like there's some variability among men, like young men are less optimistic than older men, but the gap is much, much smaller. The action is within women. And so that's so part of what's going on with the Democrats being more optimistic is Democratic women, older Democratic women, are pulling those numbers up and Democratic men too. But it's like it's really the what's making the here's another way of saying it. Democrats would, in this survey, which, like you said, was done a month or so before the election, Democrats would probably look even more optimistic if it wasn't for the young women among them that are really the main pessimists out there about the future. And again, part of it connecting it back to the mental health thing, it tracks with younger women are more likely to report, anxiety and depression problems, these kind of internalizing problems that really give you sort of a dark view and I don't have data on this, but there's a lot of messaging in academia or in cultural media that young women consume, or even on social media. Um, that's pretty pessimistic, right? That's that promotes a sort of like doom outlook about their lives in the future. And so I don't know if young women are also like consuming more of that type of media, whereas again, the older women are like, oh, you don't know, like you don't understand all the progress you don't appreciate all the progress we've made, what life used to be like, the barriers women used to have when we were young. And so again, they might be more wise or have more appreciation for progress. But yeah, I wanted to, in the report, I couldn't, you start to break things down three or four ways and the sample sizes get pretty small. But one thing I will say that's not in there explicitly, I don't think, is that if you look at it another way, if you look within political party, and look at age, you can clearly see that the biggest age gap, the biggest age difference is among Democrats. So it's like young Democrat are way more pessimistic than older Democrats. And I remember again, using because I was a professor for a long time is why I keep picking on academia. But I remember when I was a professor, like you would hear old professors talk about this kind of stuff where it's like it seemed like there was a difference between the liberals back in the day. And again, some of this might have been like just their own bias, but there was a more of a openness, a tolerance, a sort of like belief in change and progress compared to the young progressives on campus, even the young faculty like professors um, that had more of this like the sky's falling attitude. So I think there's something interesting going on there. Whereas it seems like in general, like the Republicans there's just more stability. And there was a bit of a generational difference, but there was just more stability. And like you said, that at that time they were under, you know, the Democratic, the Democrats were in power or had the presidency. So maybe we need to repeat this survey in the coming months and see how that changes. But I suspect that the political thing might change somewhat, but the generational thing seems stable and consistent with lots of other research suggesting that young people are just, on the whole, more pessimistic about the future.
That's very interesting. Do we have data showing that this anxiety that's often talked about with young people that has actually increased over time? And is that just self-reported, or are there objective metrics such as suicide
Mhm.
rates that show an actual increase in mental distress among young people?
Yeah. So this is hotly debated. So there certainly at the self-report level, yes. Like young people today are saying they're more anxious and depressed than older people. There are some more objective outcomes, whether it's hospitalizations, suicide attempts, and related things that like other people reporting and related things that you could say also are consistent with that. But even still, you have some experts that are saying, well, part of the hospitalization thing might have something to do with better reporting. I mean, these are like the statistics of this are hotly debated between people who think this is a real problem. Young people are a lot less mentally well today than they were in previous generations, versus people who think maybe there's something going on, but a lot of this might be reporting bias and cultural changes. So it might be that on the self-report side, young people today see normal, this is one of the things I've written about a little bit, are more likely to interpret normal psychological distress that's not at all pathological. It's just part of, being a human being. More likely to characterize that as being in the language of mental health. And so I think there's definitely evidence consistent with that, what sometimes referred to as the pathologization of like normal psychology. Or there's an idea called concept creep, which is similar, which is we're expanding these terms to mean things that they don't didn't originally mean. So I think that's definitely part of the story. In addition to that, there seems to be some evidence that young people are consuming a lot of media that is um, using mental health language in this way. That's encouraging that kind of thinking. It's like, oh, so for instance, like people, I can't remember the exact percentage, but it's not small. A fairly high percentage of people self-diagnose. Right? So they say, I have depression. They didn't get a clinical assessment. They say, I have depression. And when you ask, well, how do you know that? They said, well, they got online and they looked at something. And the more people, there is some research that the more people use the internet to inform them about mental health, the less accurate their knowledge is. So all this stuff is going on that adds further, makes it more difficult, I should say, to know to what extent this is a real issue versus to what extent there are these like changes in both our reporting and how we talk about and think about these issues that makes it seem like young people are more distressed today than they were in the past, when really they're actually experiencing relatively similar levels of distress. If that, I don't know if that made any sense at all.
No, that did. So it seems like some of it may be hypochondria, but regardless,
hmm
there is some evidence that young people may have a darker view of the world.
Yeah.
This gets into that Visions of the Future
hmm
initiative that I mentioned in the introduction. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And one thing I'll add too to that last point, even if it's just the case, best case scenario, even if it's just the case that what's really going on here is people are pretty much the same. Young people are pretty much the same psychologically today as they were in previous decades. They're just using the language of mental health more. Even if that's true, it's a problem because there's also research that when people start to think of themselves as mentally unwell, they put themselves on the path to being mentally unwell. So, as one example, if you think of yourself as someone that suffers from an anxiety disorder, you might say, "Well, I should avoid my anxiety triggers." Or you might use that as an excuse to cultivate an environment in which you are like trying to prevent an anxiety attack. Well, that makes you more likely to develop anxiety, because what you should be doing is moving forward and like exposing yourself to the things that make you uncomfortable and working through it, which is in fact what would happen if you went to a good clinical psychologist and they were trying to help you work through these fears. And so by self-diagnosing, by using the language of mental illness, and then by taking that as a way to be like, well, I should avoid certain things, it's kind of a recipe for becoming more anxious. So that's just to say it could become a self-fulfilling prophecy. What we found in the Visions of the Future report, which I think is a really cool project. If anyone's interested in it, they can just on our website, humanflourishinglab.org, under research. There's a project called Exploring American Vision of the Future. And what I like about this is normally we do these surveys like we just talked about, right? Where we go out and we ask the public, hey, what do you think about this? And so it's like self-reported attitudes. And this project, we partnered with a team, with a firm, a London-based firm called Discover AI. And they have a team of experts who kind of, who go out and, try to figure out the vibe, what's going on, like how are people talking about things on, and particularly online. And then they have their own machine learning platform that allows them to go and pull from all these different websites. And so what we did on this project was like, where are the media outlets that young people are reading? Where are the like online spaces where they're talking, where they're commenting on posts, where they're directly engaging with each other, where they're posting things themselves? And then you can use those tools to be like, okay, here's the kind of topics we're interested in that all involve like thinking about the future. So you can think about things like technology, artificial intelligence, medical advancements, climate change, just anything that relates to how they might think about culture wars, the American dream. So we kind of came up with a list of a general list of topics that young people might be talking about. And then we're like, okay, what are they saying? Give us, so this is kind of a qualitative assessment that's pulling from these different sources to get a sense of like, what's the vibe? What are young people doing? So it's really, really cool. It's a very graphics driven report because um, it's almost like what you would do. In fact, this is what Discover AI does most of the time. It's like almost like you would do if you were a brand looking, a marketing, marketing firm or like a brand looking to see what young people think about different styles or aesthetics or their attitudes about certain products or something like that. So it's like we did that, but instead of looking at products, we looked at like visions of the future. And what we found, there's a lot of interesting things in there and, detailed things about specific topics like climate change or even like entertainment. So, people watch shows like Fallout or I can't, some of these other kind of like futuristic dystopian shows. Like, what are they into? What are they talking about? Are they just fun, or do they think this is like what's going to happen in the future? Anyway, so there's a bunch of interesting content in there for anyone who's interested. But basically what we tried to do after going through these themes and characterizing the conversations around them is we tried to map to some extent like the volume of these conversations. Like, are they positive? Do they lean more positive and lean more negative? And what we found though, there's certainly bright spots. There's certainly places where young people seem excited about the future, like around for advancements in health. Like there's all sorts of technological and medical advances that make them excited that, they might have healthier lives in the future than previous generations. But on the whole, they're more pessimistic, which is consistent with our survey reports, right? Like they're more pessimistic. They're more worried about what the dangers of artificial intelligence or the dangers of climate change. They're more likely to think that the American dream has been lost. They're worried about how polarization and culture wars. So it's just kind of a nice. It was kind of a nice complement to some of the more direct survey work we do, which is instead of just asking people what they think, let's just see how these conversations unfold. One other quick thing I'll say about that, what I think is especially cool, is like if you think about the attitudes that we have and share with other people, they're very social. Like young people get together and they talk. They can bring each other up, they can bring each other down. We say this sometimes. It's like, oh, someone's being a buzzkill, or that some, that I'm in an environment that's like not good for my, well-being or whatever. So I think it's another nice way of thinking about this is not just individual reporting, but in the spaces where people, and in this case, especially young people, in the spaces that they're gathering, what's the mood? And it's more negative, it's darker than it is brighter, unfortunately. But that also gives us opportunities for where can we focus for those of us who believe there's good reason to believe in progress and to have a brighter vision of the future. That gives us some opportunities, some places to target. So like, okay, people think this. Well, let's go in and see what they're saying. Maybe they're wrong. I mean, a lot of times, as in your work, like a lot of people just have inaccurate, understanding of progress. Like they think the world's gotten worse on certain objective measures in which it's gotten better. So that gives us an opportunity to see like where perhaps can we go into and try to persuade people or influence these conversations in a more like positive and constructive direction. So that's why I'm really excited about that project and what it can potentially help us with.
It's true that people seem to have many different misapprehensions about material progress. Many people don't realize the extent of the global decline in extreme poverty, for
Mhm.
example. But as an existential psychologist, your work focuses not so much on material progress, but emotional and mental well-being. And many people
Mhm.
speak about how today, despite our having so much material progress, many people believe that there is a crisis of meaning.
Mhm.
I'm curious what your thoughts are on that. But before you answer whether you think there's a crisis of meaning, could you elucidate the difference between meaning and happiness? Because I'm not sure that's
Mhm.
clear necessarily to most people.
Well, traditionally in psychology, happiness is falls under the category of emotion. Like to feel happy is is an emotional state. It's a mood. So you might say the at the emotional level, in the moment you feel good or bad. Um, and if you tend to feel good with a certain duration of time over the period of a day, you might say I'm happy. Like and if that's day to day, you might say I'm a happy person. So you can also think of it as a personality characteristic that's based on your general emotional proclivity towards positive mood. Now, when we think about meaning, and to be clear, I should say there are philosophers and psychologists and other people that talk about happiness in a different way, in a richer way. Um, but that's generally how I think about happiness. It's just that it's mainly an emotion, right? Um, when we talk about meaning, we're adding in some other cognitive and motivational dimensions. So what meaning really is as humans, we're smart, right? We have the ability to self-reflect. We turn inwards, we think about who we are, who we want to be, what our place in the world is. We ask these existential questions that other organisms presumably don't ask because they lack the cognitive sophistication to step outside of themselves and, reflect on their sense of self, their self-consciousness. So when we ask these kind of questions, um, we want answers, right? We're also a species that likes closure. We like to answer the questions that we ask. And so when we ask these questions about why am I here, what purpose do I, what's my function, what am I supposed to be doing? It turns out if you feel like you do have some purpose, if you feel like you're playing a significant role in the world, that you're adding value in some way, you have a greater sense of meaning. You feel like your life is full of meaning. And that tends to be associated with happiness. And it's bidirectional. So research shows that when you're in a good mood, it's easier for you to see how your life's meaningful. This gets back to the mental health and attitude thing we were saying. If you just have a good mood, it's just you tend to see the positive more than the negative. When you focus on the positive more, it's easier to like build the case that, oh yeah, like I'm doing things are going well. My life is meaningful. But it doesn't mean that meaning and happiness are synonymous because they're correlated. For instance, you can come up with examples in which they would be uncorrelated. So think about something that you really value that you do that's actually stressful and unpleasant. Those of us who are parents can easily come up with some examples of that. It's not like that. It's not like being a parent is fulfilling, it's rewarding, a lot of times it is fun and we have fun with our kids. But sometimes it's difficult. We have to be the bad guys. It's stressful. We're responsible for these humans. Um, but it turns out that parents report the highest levels of meaning when they're doing things with their kids. And sometimes those things aren't fun, right? But you know you're important, that you have an important role to play. And so it's that sense of significance that often goes hand in hand with good feelings, but doesn't necessarily have to. You don't have to be a parent to realize this. If you've pursued any kind of personal ambition, a career where you've had to do something that's very, very difficult, very, very stressful, but you think very important. If you've done any kind of volunteer work, or even, people who work in difficult jobs, medicine, police, who have to see some tough stuff. They might be going through a really bad day while simultaneously feeling extremely meaningful. So happiness and meaning don't have to be coupled. but that's just to say they often are. And like I said, it goes the other direction too. When you feel meaningful, you subsequently tend to be happier. Like meaning fuels happiness. Because even if you're doing, and this is what, this can speaks to the complexity, the emotional complexity of the human experience. Say you're doing something really stressful and difficult, or even physically unpleasant. Say you're training for a marathon or something. It's a personal goal that you want to see yourself make progress on, and you're exercising discipline, you're making progress towards that goal, which feels good. It makes you have a sense of agency, it helps give you a sense of meaning, but it's unpleasant. You're getting up at 4 a.m. before work, running in the cold, and it's horrible. It's physically uncomfortable. So in the moment, you might be, this sucks, but you might be like, yeah, I'm doing this. I'm proud of myself. And subsequently, you're going to be happier, right? Because the rest of the day, you're going to be like, that was very unpleasant in the moment, but I'm glad I did it. In fact, if you got lazy, pushed the alarm away, and didn't get up the rest of the day, you might be in a bad mood, even though you had the momentary like relief of not having to do that. So that's to say that when we judge our emotional lives, we're not just organisms, a living stream of consciousness in the moment. We're looking over time, even, time just across the day, and we're saying, "Oh, I had a good day. I'm happy because I was agentic. I did the things I was supposed to do. I took my responsibilities seriously, and as a result, I'm a meaningful member of my family, of my community, even though some of that stuff was no fun." And thus, as a result, I'm happier. So that's how I see those concepts as related, connected, but not necessarily synonymous.
It reminds me of that famous uh, JFK speech about going to the moon not because it is easy, but because it is hard. It does seem like there is a facet
Hmm.
of human psychology where we crave challenging endeavors. And as we've had all of this material progress, so living
Hmm.
standards have gone up. Some people say that the fact that life has become easier and less challenging has contributed to what they call a crisis of meaning in the modern world. What are your thoughts on this? Do we have a crisis of meaning?
It depends on when you ask me. I've certainly in the past been somebody who's expressed that concern. Looking at some of the data that people who have that concern, point to, declining religion, declining fertility rates, declining marriage rates. If you think about a lot of the social structures, cultural structures, and institutions that have long shepherded humans together towards projects that make us feel transcendent, that make us feel like we're a meaningful part of a family and a community, and you see those things declining, then it stands to reason that there's some existential vulnerabilities here. Like, how are people finding meaning if they don't have faith, if they don't have family, if they don't have these things? So I think there's some, and then you look at young people's some of the stuff we already talked about, which correlates with meaning, depression, anxiety. Anxiety and meaning are really, they're highly related because meaning is a buffer, is a protector from it. It's an anxiety buffer. When your life feels meaningful, you're just more robust against hardship, right? You're just more likely to feel confident, to feel like you can persevere, and to see a bigger picture. Like, yeah, right now this is difficult and I'm worried, I'm anxious, but I have a reason to be here. I have a purpose and I can push through. So that really, meaning is very protective. So it's possible that, maybe part of the rising rates of anxiety, if those rates are real, are related to decreased meaning. So that's what people who say that's meaning crisis. On the other hand, the reason I say it depends on when you ask me, there's also other evidence that shouldn't be ignored, that on the whole, people generally see their lives as meaningful and are pretty good at detecting meaning. It's like one of our main like quests in life is to find and preserve meaning. And just because traditional sources of meaning are declining, perhaps people are creating new sources of meaning that we're not doing a good job capturing. They're creating new, so there's a lot of negativity around social media, for instance. and people are like, oh, well, social media is causing all these problems. We're, gonna in the next few weeks be releasing a report at the university or at the Human Flourishing Lab on a concept we call digital flourishing. And we're surveying, we're looking at people, Americans, and the ways in which they're fulfilled by their technological experiences online. And it seems like, just to give you a hint of that, it seems like the majority of Americans are digitally flourishing, and that's strongly related to their mental and social health. And so, you know, it's not to say that there aren't people suffering from a meaning crisis. The other problem is how big of a problem is something before we call it a crisis. And one of the things that a lot of people criticize fairly is that we like see everything as a crisis. So maybe there are existential vulnerabilities that are emerging. I'm going to try to find like a middle ground here. Maybe there are unique existential challenges that are emerging in a highly affluent, abundant, secular world with rapid technological change in which the traditional structures that have binded us are loosening, and there's a lot of dynamism, there's a lot of movement, there's a lot of things going on that we think of as good for like economic growth, for exploration of new ideas, for creativity, but that it also make us feel unsettled and leave us a little bit anxious about, because we don't have stability, or they're not the way they used to be. And so as a result, there are some existential vulnerabilities, perhaps for some people more than others, but then at the same time, that creates opportunities. And we do know that humans are innovative, they're creative, we're problem solvers. And so I tend to be more like, if I go back and forth on this, it's because I don't totally know the answer. But I tend to be a little bit more bullish on the idea that we're existential entrepreneurs. Like we create new sources of meaning, or we return, and we haven't talked about nostalgia yet, but I do a lot of work in the psychology of nostalgia. And a lot of times what's going on there is we're not just trying to go to the past and like repeat what we did before, but we're pulling ideas. And so you do see a lot of conversations around family right now, people saying, well, families used to eat dinner together, families used to do this, or people used to do this. And so I think the healthy response to that is not to say, well, we're just going to go back, but it's to say there's wisdom in the past. There's ideas in the past that like persisted for a reason, perhaps. Um, and there's ways to make them applicable to today, even if they're not identical, even if they're not the same. That we can pull from them and we can create, we can combine, and we can do new things. So from that perspective, given all the intellectual assets we have as a species, I'm more confident that even as we struggle through transitions of that might make some existential vulnerabilities, we'll come out of it okay. People will find meaning, but that's not to overlook or to dismiss the real struggles that some people are having, finding their place in the world and dealing with the changing society.
Absolutely. I think that we probably don't have a lot of data. Maybe you probably know more about this than I do, but we probably don't have a lot of data about how people in the distant past, how meaningful they felt their lives were. That kind of survey data did not exist. It may
Yeah.
be related to this pop psychology idea of Maslow's hierarchy of needs at a time when most people were barely scraping by. Finding meaning in their lives was not something that received as much attention, perhaps. One way to try to figure out whether affluent societies in particular have a crisis of meaning might be, if we can't look at what our ancestors were feeling because we don't have that data, would be to look
Mhm.
at impoverished countries today,
Mhm.
to people who have a much lower standard of living report anxiety? Do they report that they are having an existential crisis of meaning, or do they
Mhm.
not think about that kind of thing as much? What do you know about this topic?
So from from when the last time I looked into this, which wasn't that long ago, the research was that in poorer countries, people do report higher meaning than in richer countries. Part of that is mediated by higher levels of religiosity as well. And so, and even though not all of it is mediated by that, that represents a good part of the story. In addition to that, and even though they report lower happy, this gets to that speaks to that point about happiness is not the same as meaning, because I think in rich Western countries people are happier, um, but in poorer countries people report lower happiness but higher meaning. Um, and part of that might be it's easier for them to detect meaning because they can really see how they matter if it's a daily grind for survival, and they can really see how much people depend on them and they're in very like close communities. Perhaps it's easier for that person who's looking for food and water and shelter, or that's a more difficult challenge to see like how they matter. Whereas, maybe in the modern affluent world, you have a lot more people that are like, I'm sitting in this cubicle, like typing on a keyboard. It's not that you're not doing something important. It's just it's not as direct, you're not as directly, sourcing food and shelter. I don't know if that's true. I mean, I don't know if that's the explanation, but I do know that at least the last time I looked at the literature on this, in poorer countries, people report higher meaning. That being said, within rich countries, poor people report lower meaning than higher income people, I believe. So there's a cultural story there too. And this might relate to, again, I don't know for sure, but this might relate to some of the tensions you have or fixations you have on income inequality and these kinds of issues. Because within us, and also the failure to appreciate progress, as you pointed out, people don't do a great job of like taking a global perspective on progress and focusing on how, wow, there's literacy rates are improving, especially for girls in poor parts of the world. It's hard for them to fixate on that when they're on social media saying, "Oh, look, people have like, look at these rich people and how the lives they're presenting, at least, how they have these wonderful lives where they're doing all these amazing things." So in our modern, technologically advanced, wealthy world, we might just be dealing with a whole different set of cultural issues that separate us from other parts of the world. Where there's a sort of irony, like the privilege of having this technology and being able to be on Instagram looking at these things makes it more difficult to really see like the meaning in your own life because you're doing these kinds of unhealthy social comparisons. Again, there I'm kind of being speculative. I don't know. Um, but you're right to point out that's a good way to look at some of this stuff is to look cross-culturally and look at societies that we would say they're actually living closer to where we would have lived in the past when we weren't able to survey our own population. And it does seem like, at least in the last research I saw, there are higher reports of meaning tied to perhaps a greater religiosity, as well as a greater sense of like social connection.
Those two possibilities, the religiosity and the social connection, make more sense to me than the possibility you mentioned that it is the nature of work in poor societies that maybe increases the sense of meaning. Because when
Hmm.
I imagine someone whose children are always on the verge of starvation, who is barely able to provide for them, uh, that to me sounds horrific and like it would
Yeah, yeah.
actually uh, not contribute to a sense of meaning. Whereas if you are working at a desk typing away all day and you're an insurance salesman or something like
Hmm.
that, uh, maybe your job is not as viscerally connected, you're to what you're doing with your hands. It makes me think of Marx's idea of the alienation of labor, I guess what you propose there, but you're able to provide for your children at a much
Hmm.
higher level, and seeing the joy
Yeah.
on your child's face when they are, at a dance recital after you paid for those dance lessons, or they are at, Busch Gardens or some experience that you were
Hmm.
able to provide for them thanks to your hard work, it would seem to me that that would contribute to a sense that you are useful and a sense of meaning. So I'm actually surprised by that. That seems counterintuitive to me. But what you were saying
You,
about the decline of traditional sources of meaning, such as
mhm.
family, and we have seen lower rates of family formation, organized religion, those. make more intuitive sense to me. And that gets into what you were talking about regarding possible solutions, maybe drawing inspiration from some aspects of the past. And so I want to ask you about your book, Past Forward, how nostalgia can help you live a more meaningful life. And at Human Progress, my team and I are obviously very hesitant about certain forms of nostalgia. There is a
Hmm.
real danger of romanticizing the past too much, romanticizing poverty in particular.
Hmm.
But in this book, you talk about some of the positive aspects of nostalgia. So sell me on nostalgia.
Yeah. Okay. First, I want to respond, if it's okay, I want to respond real quickly
Absolutely.
to your last point about the providing for your kids.
Mm,
I actually think you're 100% right. And what I was saying is a possibility, a possible explanation, I don't think is inconsistent with what you said. And the
mm,
reason is because you proposed a very healthy and positive view of why work is meaningful, which I totally agree with. And I've written about this a lot actually, is that a lot of the cultural messaging we hear now is, I don't like my job, it's not meaningful, or I can't, because people are focusing on, they're trying to avoid the unpleasant or the difficult parts of work. A better way to reframe that is, even when your work is not fun, or even when even when it's boring, or whatever the case may be, if you frame it as, I'm contributing to my, I'm doing something and I'm supporting a family. The people who are able to do that do find more meaning in their work. So I don't think the problem is inherently that poor people find their work more, like people in impoverished societies find their work more meaningful. The point is that meaning ultimately is about matter, being able to detect how much you matter. And in the societies, what I'm suggesting, again, just suggesting or speculating, it's easier to see how you matter because it's like, if I don't do this, we're out of luck. My family desperately needs me. Helps explain why, for instance, in times of war, sometimes people actually report higher meaning. It's, something unpleasant, something horrible, but they're like, I'm doing something really important here, which is different from saying I'm liking what I do. Um, but I think you're right. Like the challenge in the Western world with, you see the anti-work movement, you see the UBI movement, you see these sorts of things. I think they're misunderstanding why work is important to meaning. And it's true that people who are employed have higher meaning than people who are unemployed. So first of all, work is associated with meaning. Um, but where can be meaningful is not just in like the thing you're doing being personally stimulating, which is great. Like, it's good, right? If you want to find work that fits your characteristics, your qualities, your interests, your skills. Um, but really the people who are going to feel the most meaningful, and this ties to things like the fertility decline, is when they see how what they're doing matters to others. And there's been experimental research on this in organizational psychology. In a workforce, on a team, if people are thinking about how their work contributes to the betterment of society or to other people, they find that work more meaningful and they get a greater sense of meaning themselves than their colleagues who are doing the same work but don't think of it don't connect it to that contribution to society. So that's all to say is I think you're 100% right about that. The problem is how we talk about work in our culture and this movement of like work's not meaningful. Um, if I don't like it or if I don't, or if it's boring or whatever the case, if it's hard or whatever. I think what's really important is that sense of, no, I'm doing something to take care, like you said, to get the rewards of how my children benefit from that. It's that transcendent component of like, this is not just about me. This is about how I contribute. So anyway, I hope that makes sense. Onto the
that does.
nostalgia. Yeah, onto the nostalgia book. So it's been a goal of mine with not very high success, I don't think, to convince the people in the progress movement that nostalgia is a force for progress. that is largely a force for progress. There are dark sides of nostalgia, but they're far outweighed by the positives of nostalgia. Um, here's an example. People will say, well, it's kind of like you pointed out, people romanticize the past. And you see this on the left and the right. Oftentimes people like associate this with conservatives. Um, but we can go through a long list of ways that people on the left um, have this like view of the past of people just lived in harmony with nature and we didn't need material things and life was great and we just, like a Disney movie or something, or maybe we even talk to animals or uh, something like that, which of course, if you study history at all, like it was way more violent and difficult and perilous than that. So yes, that kind of historical romanticization of the past exists, but for most people, most of the time, that's not how they're using nostalgia, including some of the most nostalgic people I've met who are very active in the progress movement, but have nearly no self-aware, nearly zero self-awareness of their nostalgia. So let me ask you, how many times have you heard at some event or talk or people in this space a nostalgia of we used to be a country that built things. We used to not have all these regulations. We used to just be able to build a bridge in, weeks instead of going through all these regulations. Americans were proud, or we went to the we went to the moon. We even within the progress movement of the people that are the most skeptical about nostalgia, a lot of their own inspiration that drives them is pulled from their past or a historical past when they felt like we had World's Fairs, we did this, we did that, we had visionaries. Um, we weren't so afraid of building. We didn't have this like passive pessimism or whatever. The point being that like I don't think it's the case for most of the time that nostalgia is making people see the past as better. I think what's happening is that the people are getting the causal direction wrong. People are seeing the present as bad or see problems in the present, and that's making them become nostalgic to find inspiration. Nostalgia isn't making them see the present as bad. People seeing the present as bad is making them nostalgic. And the progress people are doing the same thing. They're saying things aren't great right now. There's too much negativity. There's too much there's too much like romantic attitudes around socialism. There's too many barriers to building and creating and entrepreneurship. And I think they're doing the same thing a lot of people are doing, which is saying, okay, well, where can I find the ideas and the inspirations of how to do things differently and to pull from that? To take it away from progress entirely, think about an artist, a filmmaker, a musician, and they're saying, I want to do something new. I really want to change the game up and do something really creative that's never been done before. What do they do? What did I like listening to when I was young? What made me passionate about this project? Who is my favorite filmmaker? Who's my favorite musician? What can I pull from that touches on on my culture, on my people, where I'm from? And then how can I make it new? And so a lot of times that's really what nostalgia is. It's not running to the past to try to like repeat it. It's pulling that kind of inspiration because you're recognizing we only can go forward. We don't have time machines. And I want to change the future in a positive way. And the past might have some clues. That's not to say that there aren't people that don't, on the extremes, that don't say we should just go back to the way things were. I just don't think there's as many of those people as we think. And if somebody says they are, within 5 minutes, you can disabuse them of that by saying, okay, like you think the past was better. Are you prepared to give up the technological and medical innovations that might, like if you get diagnosed with cancer today, you want the treatment from 1950 or the treatment today, right? Do you want your daughter to have the opportunity she had in 1950 or the opportunity she has today? And then they change their tune. So anyway, that's my pitch. And I'm prepared to litigate it with data. But I've been giving talks and stuff around nostalgia, showing experimental research, showing personality research. For instance, the people who are the most dispositionally prone to nostalgia also tend to be the most open-minded. It's not that people who are nostalgic are more closed-minded. They're actually more open-minded. They're more creative. And so I think there's a lot of false ideas around nostalgia that aren't empirically substantiated. And then there's a little bit of stuff where nostalgia is, where there's some research that, here are the kind of ways that nostalgia can be bad. Um, but they're far outnumbered by all the positives.
That's very interesting. I'll admit that I am a bit of a nostalgia skeptic, but when you put it that way as a form of historical perspective, identifying the positive in the past, but also being able to see the past for what it was, I think that probably can be very helpful. And maybe that relates to what you were saying earlier about older people who have still a memory of what
Hmm.
life was like in the past, tend to be
Right.
more optimistic about the future, which is actually surprising to me because we do have this stereotype of younger people as more
Right.
optimistic inherently, which is sadly no longer the case.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's true. And another way to think about nostalgia in that way is so we've been talking about historical nostalgia. A lot of times people are doing what we call personal nostalgia, which is they're not saying life was better in the 1950s or the 1800s or pre-industrialization. They're not even doing that exercise. And they're doing something more intimate, which is the nostalgia like I've studied the most, which is they're looking to their own past, right? And so I would, here's just to use myself as an example. I can look back to college and be like, oh, this was an exciting time, all sorts of opportunities and figuring out what I want to do with my life and uncertainty and the sort of the adventure of that, feeling free, in a lot of ways. Now, I don't actually want to go back to like I don't want to be like it was a stressful time too. But I'm not focusing on the stressful parts of it. I'm focusing on the positive parts of it, which we tend to do. It's a concept in psychology called fading affect bias, which is good for our psychological well-being, that negative experiences tend to fade. Their impact tends to fade faster than positive experiences. So it's easier to look back to the past with rose-tinted glasses, as you know. Um, but that's not necessarily bad because what we're doing is we're saying, I'm not saying I want to be a college student again. What I'm saying is, oh, when I do that, it kind of makes me feel younger now. Like, oh, it may make me a little bit more bold and confident that like, oh, I did some stuff before. Like, why can't I do, why can't I try a new hobby now? Why can I, so nostalgia has this effect, this energizing youthfulness effect as well. You know, this phrase, youth is wasted on the young. It's like through nostalgia, it's like it's not wasted on the young because I can capture that youthful spirit. And in fact, we did some research years ago on this, and what we found is around the age of 40, depended on the study, some studies it was 38, some studies it was 41 or 42. But around that time period, you start to find a statistically significant effect in which nostalgia makes people feel younger than their biological age. So this is a concept called subjective age. And it matters because the age you feel is often how you act. You could be young and act old. Like you could be like, I can't do anything, and you could be like, or you could be old and act young and be like, I can try new things. I can be energized. I can go out in the world and do things. And so the more nostalgic people are, the more they feel the lower the subjective age. Again, around 40, that starts to happen. I don't know why then. The only thing I can think of is that's the age where you actually, as someone who's 48, that's the in your 40s is when you actually start to feel where your vision declines, you start to have more aches. It's hard, you recover slower from the gym or from a night out drinking or whatever the case may be. And so maybe you're more aware of like, oh, like I'm getting older, and then you can really tap into that youthful energy. And a lot of the time, I just bring up that example because a lot of the times our nostalgia isn't some historical analysis. It's a very personal relationship we have with our own past, in which we're constantly moving forward. The world is changing. We have decisions to make. We have to figure out where to prioritize our time, what we care about the most. And nostalgia sort of helps direct us. It reminds us of what experiences we cherish, where we found the most meaning in our life, and that helps us make decisions. And I think a lot of times that's where the action is in nostalgia. It's not in these, like grand historical analyses. It's in the more personal day to day. But that pushes us forward. Nostalgic people are more confident, they're more motivated to pursue their goals, they're more trusting of others, they're more willing to help others, they donate more to charity. And again, I think it's because we're like pulling from our bank of meaningful memories that energizes us and motivates us.
That's interesting. Obviously, many of these memories are probably with loved ones. I
Hmm.
saw in a writing of yours that younger generations, though, are more likely to report nostalgic memories where they were alone.
Hmm.
Perhaps that relates to this broader trend of traditional sources of meaning, such as
Hmm.
family, organized religion, community, shrinking. Do you think that there is anything to this critique that we're becoming more atomized and
Hmm.
lonely? And if so, is this a problem caused by modern society and wealth? And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's another one of those, like, it depends on the day you ask me. It is true on, for one data point is, and this is something we'll be releasing in this upcoming report on digital flourishing I mentioned. It is true that we find and others find that young people um, report feeling less socially connected than older people. And, again, in some ways that's sort of counterintuitive because we tend to think of young people as being around their peers a lot, doing a lot of things, having more time to hang out with others. Um, but at the same time, as you get older, perhaps you have more opportunities to cultivate not just opportunities for interacting with others, but like those deep bonds. And loneliness is an interesting thing because it's not just loneliness isn't just I'm hanging out with people. Loneliness is like I have these deeper, meaningful relationships. So somebody can feel lonely and be surrounded by other people, right? They can move to a city, start a new job, have lots of colleagues, have lots of neighbors, but not really have any deep relationships and feel deeply alone. Where somebody could live out in the frontier, not see a lot of people, but the small group they do see be deeply interdependent with, right? They depend on each other for survival and for like getting the work done or whatever, and they have very, very close bonds. So it's not as simple as are you around people or not. Um, and so young people might be around people. That's true. They might be around their peers a lot. But the question is, do they feel more disconnected? And the data seems to suggest yes. But at the same time, there's this recent paper that came out that was showing that the relationship between age and loneliness is actually more kind of U-shaped, which is young people and old people report the highest levels of loneliness, and then loneliness dips in midlife, which seems like a plausible explanation is that we just talked about the young stuff, but on the old side, it might be that they are experiencing physical decline, retirement, loss of loved ones, to becoming widows or whatever. Or like physical mobility is a challenge. It's hard to get out and do things. And so you might have older people feeling lonely for different reasons that young people feel lonely. Whereas in midlife, people tend to be surrounded by families, colleagues, coworkers, and things like that. But also, as far as like the trends, like young people, I mean, they are less likely to marry or they're waiting longer to marry, which maybe contributes to feeling of loneliness. The remote work thing's an interest, we have these new trends of like people are like maybe alone more. And at least from what I understand, I'm a remote worker. And what I understand, and I love it, it's actually allowed me to have better relationships. I've been able to move closer to family, for instance. But one of the things I think I've seen in the research is that maybe for people in middle age or people a little bit older who have already built professional networks and already have those relationships, it's easier to transition to remote work and not feel lonely because it's like I already know these people, so staying in touch with them online through Zoom meetings or whatever. I'd like to see them in person, go out have a drink or whatever, but it's like I already built that bond. But for young people coming up, especially the kids who maybe were, their schools were shut down during COVID, and so they were doing remote learning, and then, in high school and college, or they did a lot of online courses in college. They're starting these jobs, and they're not, it could be that we're having more people, young people, that just aren't having as many opportunities, perhaps, to build those relationships, the foundations that would then allow them to work remote or whatever and still have good connections. Again, I don't know. This is all speculation. Or, of course, there's the possibility we talked about with the mental health thing that they're actually not any more socially disconnected than other generations are in the past. They just think they are because we're all telling them they are. We're all worried. We're like all worried about this. And it's almost as if you ask the question, like, are you lonely? Like, well, I didn't really think about it before, but maybe I am. As a psychologist who does a lot of this research, it does make me wonder sometimes, are we like asking people too much how they feel? Kind of planting the seed that they should feel a certain way. But yeah, these are definitely that this is, I'm not trying to belittle that issue. I mean, there obviously are people struggling with social disconnection. Marriage rates are lower. A lot of people do report not having any friends or not having any close friends. I mean, these are some concrete things you can ask people, um, and more people are saying they don't have have anyone they can depend on. And so I do think that those are like legitimate worrying trends that that warrant some. And I'm not one of these people that necessarily blames technology or social media, anything like that. I think technology can actually be a very positive force that can help people find community and meet new people and plan social events. So I don't think it's the technology, but I think we should really focus on ways to use the technology to enhance social connection if people are in fact more socially disconnected or more lonely. The question to me is how can we leverage all the advances we've made in technology to help them find each other, to help people find each other and build communities.
That gets to an important point. So many people do blame technology for this
Hmm.
alleged uh, rise in loneliness or feelings of social disconnection or even a loss of meaning. But you mentioned that you have a project on digital flourishing
Hmm.
specifically
Hmm.
that finds a bit of a more positive story. So, since we usually try to end this podcast on a positive note, could you tell me a little bit about your findings there? Maybe give us a preview.
Yeah. So what we find is the vast majority of Americans, close to 80%, report to be digitally flourishing on most of the dimensions of flourishing that we measure. So we look at um, we look at different ways in which people flourish in their digital lives, from things like, am I pres do I feel able to present who I truly am online? So this kind of authentic self-disclosure, to like online communities. Do I feel like connected? Do I feel like I'm building communities? Um, think civil discourse, like civil participation. Do I feel like I know how to get to share my ideas in a way that's respectful? So we kind of ask people questions about these things, and what we find is that most people feel like they can do these things and are doing these things. And there is variability, of course, but what we find is the people who are doing these things, the people who are digitally flourishing, are more likely to be flourishing more broadly. Like, so if they feel like their online life's good, they feel like their offline life's good, right? Their mental, they feel like, so. The more we kind of we did across all age groups, but we zero in on Gen Z too, because these are the people that are digital natives, spend a lot of time online more than other generations. And they're the people, as we've talked about throughout this podcast, that lots of people are worried about, like their mental health and social health. So it seems especially important to recognize that this generation, a lot of their lives are mediated by computers. Um, I'm not one of the people that think that we should take computer like take these things. To me, the answer is if people are having struggles with these technologies, not that we should like prevent them from using them. It's like do them well, like make them strengths, things that can enhance their lives. And there's good news there. It looks like a lot of people are using these technologies in ways that help them flourish, not just online, but in their lives more broadly. So the report is positive. Most of the attention in the public discourse around this is all the bad things. And so what I hope this report does when we release it is it highlight it's not dismissing those concerns. We're not trying to say, oh, everyone's wrong if they think it's bad. We're trying to say there's a bigger picture. And the bigger picture involves lots of positive sides to our technological lives. And we're hoping we can highlight that as a way to give a better, more accurate picture, but also to offer ways in which we can think about, well, what can we learn? Here's another way of saying it. People often focus on how social media is harming like young women's self-esteem or something like that, right? Well, there's a lot of people, young women on social media that are like rocking it, like that it's they're building brands, they're finding connections, they're networking for their professions, they're sharing photos with loved ones, they're using it in all sorts of healthy ways. Well, instead of just focusing on what's going wrong, why don't we see what those people are doing as inspiration? Like, what can we learn from the people who are using these technologies in ways that actually are enhancing their lives? And that's what we're trying to highlight, and that can help other people who maybe are struggling learn the lessons of how to do it in a healthier way.
Thank you so much, Clay. On that note, I think we'll end. Please check out his work. Go to the Archbridge Institute's website where you can find information about everything we've discussed. Check out Perfectus, check out his book. Thank you once again. This has been fascinating.
Thanks so much. Yeah, it's been a great conversation. I appreciate it.